Good evening, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to the Lab School of Washington. I know we have many folks here in the audience who know our school well, parents and grandparents and friends, but also some folks for whom this might be your first time to our school. So I'd love to introduce myself. I'm Kim Wargo. I have the privilege of serving as the head of school here at Lab. As you may know, just a quick word about who we are. We are a school for students with language-based learning differences from 1st through 12th grade. We've been in the business of educating the whole child and all of their wonderful strengths and challenges since 1967, when we were founded by a pioneer in the field of learning differences by the name of Sally Smith. And if you don't know Sally by reputation, I encourage you to look her up because she's worth getting to know. Unfortunately, she passed in 2007, but our school has carried her vision forward, and we are really proud to be this amazing, vibrant place that we have to share today. Tonight, we are really delighted and thrilled to bring you the first and only in-person edition of our lecture series for this year. One of our post-COVID keepers was doing most of our lectures on Zoom because we have found that makes it easier and more accessible for a lot of people to attend. But we really felt like tonight's topic and opportunity was one we could not pass up in person. And so we're delighted to welcome you to our lecture series, Growth, and the Angela Tucker edition. So I'm going to introduce our speaker as well as our interviewer, moderator, questioner, conversationalist, who is going to kind of lead us through a discussion, and then we will save some time at the end for some questions. And we promise to keep the event to right in an hour, with opportunity for continuing the conversation at a book signing that Angela has graciously agreed to do out in Main Street, right outside where you came in. So, without any further ado, I'm thrilled to introduce to you our moderator and conversationalist for the evening, Catherine Ham, who is an entrepreneur and educator who's been a member of the Lab community since 2017. She served on our board as a trustee since 2019, and for the last several years, from 2020 through 2022, co-led an anti-racist education series for white identified parents at Lab with another parent who's also here tonight, Beth Wheeler. Catherine and her wife, Amy, who identify as white adoptive parents of a mixed-race domestically adopted son, together own and operate the nonpartisan Cook Political Report, where Catherine currently serves as the chief operating officer. And our guest of honor tonight is Angela Tucker. Angela is a Black woman adopted from foster care by white parents. She is the author of this wonderful book, which is on my summer reading list, and I hope it will be on yours as well. You Should Be So Grateful, Stories of Race, Identity, and Transracial Adoption. And the subject of Closure, a documentary that chronicles her search for her biological parents. Her mission to center adoptees is evident in her podcast, The Adoptee Next Door, and each of the 5 short films that she has produced. Angela has consulted with NBC's This Is Us, supported the lead actor of the Broadway musical Jagged Little Pill, and has over 15 years of experience working within adoption and foster care agencies, and has mentored over 200 adoptees, leading her to found the Adoptee Mentoring Society. Angela lives in Seattle, Washington, with her husband, Brian Tucker, an Emmy Award-winning filmmaker. Please welcome to the stage Catherine Ham and Angela Tucker.
Thank you, Kim. I'm really glad you guys could all be here tonight to join us in this conversation. I'm a huge fan of Angela's. So deeply grateful you could take the time out to be here tonight. So Kim, thank you for hosting, and to the Lab team, the AV team, the staff, everyone who's done so much to make this possible tonight. Thank you. We appreciate it very much. So here's just a little spoiler alert about some of my journey as an adoptive parent. One of the most important muscles that I've learned is to be able to hold complex truths and to sit in really uncomfortable situations. I hope that we hold some of that space here tonight and have an opportunity to connect with one another in support of each other. So what I would like to do as we get started would be just to kind of get a pulse point on who's in the room. This will help me and Angela as we have this conversation. Let me first ask, if you're willing, just a show of hands, if you identify as being directly connected to adoption through family structure or professional role. You may have both, neither, that you identify as a member of a mixed race family structure. Yeah. You are an adoptive parent or grandparent. You identify as a birth parent or a member of an immediate birth family, like an aunt or uncle or grandparent. Thank you. You identify as an adopted person.
Loud and proud. Yes.
So I want to open with just a quick story about where I first met Angela, which was at PAC Camp, which is a camp for adopted kids of color. Thanks to Beth Wheeler and Emmy Schachter, Amy and I found our way there at a time when our son was young. And as I like to say, we didn't know what we didn't know. In that first camp, Angela was there at the camp showing her film Closure, which is a documentary about the search for her birth mother. Have some of you seen it? Are you familiar with it? It's such a great film. It rearranged my insides, quite honestly. The next day, I saw Angela and another adult at camp sitting outside at a table. I think I was supposed to be going into a session, but I wanted to go and sit with the two of them and asked if they minded if I joined them, and they were happy to welcome me there. And so I was sitting there at the table with Angela, who identifies as an adoptee and a member of having come through foster care system. And the other adult at the table is someone who was there as a birth parent, although she also held the identity of an adopted person. And we visited, and it was such a special, beautiful moment. And the thing that struck me, and I have always carried with me, was that here I was at a table with the triad. It might not have been my triad, but it was really important to me that I was able to have this conversation with a birth parent and with an adoptee. To do so in what felt like a pretty safe, open space. I'm sure I stepped all over myself and probably laid out about 10 microaggressions conservatively. Nonetheless, they were kind enough to hold space. And so speaking of hold space, what I would like to do, because we only have an adopted person and adopted parent up on stage, is that we hold a space for the birth parent with us as we have this conversation. So moving in to the conversation, Angela, where I want to start is something that we did a little bit together not long after we met at PAC Camp, and that was you came out to DC because you were interested in launching the Adopted Life episodes. And I remember you had some very specific interest in doing that and bringing the voice of young people into the conversation. Would you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, hi everybody. Thank you so much for being here, welcoming me to DC. The Adopted Life episodes, in the bio you heard my husband is a filmmaker, so we're both kind of creative, like that sort of mindset of creating things that we don't see out there just yet, using our different skills. And he is very skilled behind the camera, working it, and I enjoy being in front in certain ways. I'm not an actress, but I understand the power that that form of media has. So I had worked with enough adoptees who were youth, kids, to hear their brilliance. And I'd worked with some of those same kids as parents who would say things like, my kid doesn't really think about adoption very much, they don't notice race, and those very same kids are like, I think about adoption every single day, I think about how nobody in this school looks like me, these kinds of comments they'll say. So I was noticing that, and also noticing that many of these white parents were really wonderful people who did a lot to make sure their children felt like they could talk with them, but the kids weren't talking to them. And so I'm like, when adoptees talk with other adoptees, magic happens. And we feel so comfortable and understood that we don't have to go into our whole backstory. It's just known. So I thought, how powerful might it be if I were to create some atmosphere that was comfortable enough for kids to speak with me like we do privately, but with a camera so that we can show it publicly. So I did that, and Catherine supported me for a DC episode. I hosted an episode in New York and one in LA, and they're all on my website, so you're welcome to view them at angelatucker.com. But it was so profound. I remember there was this one moment, for example, I think this was the New York episode, where I had been conversing with this transracial adoptee, an Ethiopian adoptee who was 14 years old, leading up to the date. So I didn't know her, had never spoken with her, but someone referred her to the show. And I remember her email was spelled FIKIRTE, maybe a number, at gmail.com or something like that. And I was curious about that, what that name, how it was pronounced, what it meant. And when I met her, I was excited and I said, hi. She says, hi, I'm Vicky. And I'm like, oh, are you the one with that email, that was a little longer? And she's like, yeah, that's me. So I'm like, oh, what is that full word? She's like, that's my name. I said, oh, I'd love to hear it. And she's like, oh, I just go by Vicky. I said, okay, yeah, but if you want to share the full name, I'd love to hear it. She said, oh, it's Fikitha. I'm like, wow, that is beautiful. And she kind of lit up and sat up a little straighter. I was like, I would be glad to call you Fikitha today on set if we can. And she was just like incredulous. And later told me it's the one and only thing her birth mother gave her was her name, but that she felt that she needed to assimilate. And so how she did that was shortened her name. And she actually had like this little jingle. She would just say like, hi, I'm Vicky. It's just like Vicky, but with an F. And to me, I was just really sad to know that she shortened her name and felt the need to do that, especially after spending those hours with her, calling her by her full name and watching her just beam. And then the conversations we had were great too. But I felt like that was an example of not just working to pronounce someone's name, which is really important to do, but also understanding the significance behind it and how that connects to our sense of belonging, and how that act, just calling her by her full name, is affirming her identity as an adoptee. It was really lovely. Would you want to share anything about your role?
Well, one of the things, it was amazing to just be around it and watch you interact with the kids, to the point of you saying that connection and how important that is and how affirming that is for them. What I remember being so taken by was two adopted sisters, both adopted from China, and they shared along the way as we were having conversation, I think it was offset, although it may have come up in the interviews, that they actually never had spoken to each other about being adopted.
Yes.
Even though they were close in age and they were friendly and they were close, but and I would say that it's a situation where the parent or parents, I only knew one of the parents, but it's not that they weren't making it a space,
right?
But whatever was happening, the kids didn't even see that they had a resource connected in the home. And that was a real awakening for me.
Yeah, it's so interesting. I host virtual mentoring now, and they are segmented by age group. So 12 to 16 years old, 16 to 22, 23 and up. And with the 23 and up adoptees, this is a group that people often forget are adoptees. People don't think about adults as adopted. I'm trying to get grants and donations for my new nonprofit, and it's always geared to kids, which is fantastic. But these adult adoptees, something that's interesting and related is that we may have a really wonderful conversation in like a group mentoring session, and I might end by being like, wow, thank you all for this conversation. It was so great. I can't wait to call my mom. I'm going to tell her all about it. And people will start crying. They will break down in tears. And then in this session, which just adoptees, they will say like, Angela, why you gotta like rub that in our face? That you have parents who will, like some of them were like, I can't even tell my parents I come to this group, or they would be devastated and think that they did a terrible job parenting. And it was important for me. I kind of say that because it's similar, but one interesting thing is noticing the differences in the generations. And I'm really heartened and excited because it does seem like the opposite for the 12 to 16-year-olds, that the parents are so excited for them to be part of the groups. They don't need to be near hovering. They're really, truly saying things like, you know, stay in your bedroom on your computer. We're going to go far away. We don't need to know what you're talking about, just have a good, and that's fascinating. It's been really a tricky point as I'm trying to mentor adult adoptees to work with youth, because a lot of these adults are triggered by the kids and how supportive their parents are.
Yeah. Can we build on this just a little bit, Angela? I know a lot of the mentoring groups you do are with kids who are transracially adopted, which may mean that it brings some visibility to their family structure and to the experience they have or connected to adoption. I'm curious about those whose experience may be invisible. So these could be same-race adopted kids. And so I'm curious about what you've learned in your experiencing mentoring kids, and whether that is, I mean, the same race could be a white parent and a white child, a black parent and a black child. What comes up in terms of that connection or feeling safe about talking? Can you share any themes that you notice and observations in that?
Absolutely. It's so complicated. Many same-race adoptees talk about feeling jealous that transracial adoptees can bring up adoption so much easier. There's like an obvious
because you can't, right?
in.
Yeah.
And for same-race adoptees, some of them talk about like, well, how do I start the conversation? It feels like it has to be something big, external. I was surprised by that. And then on top of that, when I have same-race adoptees in a group with transracial, especially white adoptees, they feel like they can't take up as much space. The sense is that transracial adoptees have an extra layer of complexity. And so as a facilitator for that, I'm always trying to send that message that we're not going to compare traumas. You know, it's, to me, that type of comment is no different than when I see this when, like, if someone's been adopted at age 10, gone through 8 foster homes, and another adoptee was adopted at 1 day, then they feel like, oh gosh, I shouldn't speak because they've had it harder. And again, let's never compare traumas. Every single adoption is traumatic for our own selves, period. So that's kind of the conversation around the same race and transracial adoptees. I think there's an assumption that same race is easier, and that also is not true, because for so much around the adoption conversation, it's easy to talk about the visible, and we are in a society that is aware of racism, but a sense of belonging is not had even when we match race.
Can you say more about that? And this is really the core of you should be grateful in this finding a place and finding belonging. It's something that we talk about here at Lab because we understand that that connection can make real differences. Say a little bit more about this piece relative to whether it's race, adoption, but the connectedness.
Well, in general, I dedicated the book to all adoptees who have ever felt huraeth. This is a word I had to learn and work really hard on when I recorded my audio book for this. And I was with my audio editor. We went on Google and we had to like listen to the word because it's a Welsh word, but there's no direct English translation, but the the definition is a deep yearning for a home that never was. Hiraeth reminds me of the word belonging. You know, belonging has longing in it, which is a yearning for, and one part of the book, I talk about this concept called the ghost kingdom, which I think plays into this sense of belonging, in the sense that the ghost kingdom is, for adoptees, we may go into a space in our brain where we're like, what if I had been raised by my birth parents? What if another adoptive family had adopted me? Not too different than how some of you might wonder, you know, what if I married that guy that I dated in high school? Or what if I went to this college instead, or grew up in, you know, it's not just related to adoptees, and it's not a trauma response unless we create a trauma out of it, which is not letting adoptees do that wondering. It's connected to belonging in the sense that there is a need for adoptees to explore those places. And when we don't allow that by stating you should be grateful for what you have, or by not understanding the need for like adoptee affinity spaces to have adoptees run them, we essentially are not allowing, we're essentially asking people to fit in instead of belong. I love, Brene Brown has a quote where she talks about the difference between fitting in and belonging. Yeah. And she says, fitting in is when you assess a situation and you change who you are to be in that place. Belonging, on the other hand, is you show up and you are acting just as you are, and you are accepted in that place. It's a tricky thing to assess because we know kids are trying to fit in with their peers in all sorts of ways. But this is a little bit different. It's not, you're not code switching. You're not, like, it's absolutely appropriate for adolescent development to try on different hats, to try on different clothing, all that kind of thing. But with belonging, there's a great example of this actually is in the DC episode of the Adopted Life series, where I chat with one of the individuals, 10-year-old, 11, and we were talking about code switching. And at that time, the child said, in front of my teachers, who are white, and they're really nice, I act really sweet, and the teachers love me, he said. And then with my black friends, like, I act really rough and I'm wild. And he elaborated a little bit, and then I said, what are you being right now? And he said, I'm not sure. And I just loved that moment. I was like, that's it.
Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, as you're talking about belonging and the adoptee experience, and that home would be the place that you might imagine you belong here, where there may be subtle things that trigger that it doesn't feel like you belong. So even separate from school where it's common, but what happens if you're a young person?
Yes.
And you're feeling disconnected at home and at school, or one place, not the other?
Subtleties for me were, my parents adopted a lot of children, all different races, very open to talking about adoption throughout our home. Not just adoption, but talking about things like nationalism and identity of America around the world. Like, they're just really into world history. I have a sister who immigrated from Laos after fleeing from a civil war, and she wasn't formally adopted, but so things like that led us to dinner time conversations were about like the Laotian Civil War. And so it led to all these things which are really great, because I think adoption isn't necessarily the trauma, but adoption isn't necessarily the difficult conversation that people talk about. It's more our discomfort with our own American history. But I think those sorts of conversations were really open in the house. Trying to remember what I was going with that.
Just thinking about belonging and at home, is it a place where
right, so the
it's
subtleties,
safe to not fit in, but to belong?
but to feel less than completely that sense of belonging at the home can be from little things like my parents have one biological daughter, and she has stunningly beautiful blue eyes that are hard to miss, just like my dad's blue eyes that are just Caribbean blue. And so even with that openness of talking about adoption and all of that, anytime someone would say to my sister, "Your eyes are so beautiful. They're just like your dad's," that was that little sense of, I don't really belong here. Mm-hmm. And I'm saying that with being given love. I wanted that experience. Mm-hmm. Someone that looked like me and having other people notice it.
So and thank you for sharing that personal story. I'm thinking about what I said at the top, sort of about holding that complex thing. As an adoptive parent, I'm thinking, wow, I'm working really hard to build that space for my kid, but there could be things that I say or that others say that he can't have that one belonging thing.
Can't have it.
And how do we hold the space of still continuing to show up and do the work and create the space while not bringing myself into it, not doing stuff that otherwise adds to the burden of it, and helping it to be with okay, however he's feeling about it.
Something that I talk about a lot is the concept of openness. And for white parents of black or brown kids, this concept of outsourcing some of the parenting duties, because you can never give us that. Mm-hmm. There are just things that you will never be able to give us, no matter how much you love us. And it's funny when I do consulting conversations, so many parents waste half their session that they're paying me for by telling me how much they love their kids. I'm like, okay, you want to spend the rest of the half hour telling me that? That's great. Or you can just know that I know that. I already know that. I lead with that. It's not going to help us with this problem that you want to work on. I give examples like my mom, when I was younger, she knows I love to read, so she'd be like, "Angela, there's this great book out. You'll love it." I'll be like, "Cool, Mom, thanks." If a black woman said the same thing, "Hey, Angela, there's this book out. You might like it," I'd be like, "I have to get it now. I need it." Like, I'd probably go to my mom as though she hadn't said anything. Like, "I just learned about this book and I got to go get it." You know, like there's things that when people mirror you, that they can offer. And so it's a tricky pill to swallow in this country that is so focused on nuclear family model, where one parent, two parents are supposed to be everything. Like, no.
While we're on that, I just want a slight pivot to come back to the birth parents, the first family, the first parents. So often absent. There are support groups for adopted parents, increasingly with folks like you providing safe spaces for young adoptees. I know that, PAC, for example, offers some support groups and connections for birth parents. Can you just share with us a little bit about, in your experience in the broader adoption community, sort of the good news, bad news? Like, what's the landscape looking like for birth parents and first parents to have and be supported in what is a very complex journey for them as well, particularly when they're cut out of the conversation a lot of the time?
I found it interesting when you polled the audience about who is here that I think one individual raised their hand that they were either a birth parent or connected to a birth parent family. I think that is interesting for several reasons. One is that there could be more birth parents in the room tonight who may not want to raise their hands as proudly as I was encouraging adoptees to, and that is indicative of the landscape. Also, another reason that birth parents may not be here tonight is because of how invisible they often are in these conversations still. Working in adoption agencies, they're an afterthought, or services are cut because it's not bringing in money, which has more to do with who birth parents typically are, which has a lot to do with how we treat individuals, and all of those sorts of structural issues is what comes up. And then for that to be like a surprise once adoptive parents are confronted with an idea of perhaps openness and allowing that birth parent into the home, there might be pushback, like they're unstable, they're unsafe. And oftentimes what I've found is the perception of safety is different than the reality of safety risks. This inclusive family support model that I created with a couple of colleagues actually talks about how openness doesn't even require birth parents to be physically present. Because I would hear from adoptive parents who maybe adopted internationally and said, oh, my kid's an orphan, well, their birth parents are probably dead, or birth parents were truly unsafe or not findable, truly. Openness is still possible because now you're talking to your kid about why they are unsafe, why they are in jail. What does that crime mean in terms of I don't know how many people are in our jails right now, but many of them are parents who love their kids. And so by a parent not talking about a birth father, a birth mother, because they are incarcerated, you're communicating a message that they are scary. Adoptees hear that I must be scary too, I'm probably a criminal too, deep down in my blood, and I'm one of those people that we shouldn't talk about, or, and that's not true. So there are lots of ways where currently we're choosing not to have birth parents be as visible and as included in the conversation.
Room for improvement.
There's room for improvement, and it has to do with our collective discomfort with speaking the truth. I say that in reference to something in my book I'm thinking about, which is this, I'll read a little bit of this section, but this commonly used phrase that adoptive parents use. They say to their child, "You weren't born in my tummy, but you were born in my heart." This is an example of what I think Americans really like to do. Instead of saying the truth, you weren't born in someone's heart. And that actually has harmed a mentee that I talk about here.
Will you take a moment and let's read this? Let's read this and continue. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Perfect.
Are you okay with some reading? Yes. Are you guys doing okay? Yes. Instead of you guys, I'm trying to say y'all, like you, a Texan.
Come on. I'll help you with it.
When was Texas on the forefront of
I better, that's, yeah.
Y'all. Y'all are cool with me reading a little bit? Okay. I'm starting mid-chapter. It's page 42 if you want to follow. Before I can ask Jessie a follow-up question, Lydia, a freckle-faced teenager with brown hair, braided in pigtails, blurts out, "I just want my parents to tell me the truth about my adoption. They think I can't handle it, but I can. I just want to know why I had to be adopted." In typical Adoptee Lounge fashion, we explore these topics, interweaving them with silly teenage antics and stories about the latest fad on Instagram and TikTok challenges. After the session concludes and I'm straightening up the classroom, I notice Lydia hasn't left. She begins helping me stack the chairs and says, "My mom calls my birth mom my tummy mommy and says that I grew in her heart. But I know that I grew in my birth mother's uterus, not her tummy. And unfortunately, I had to find this out the hard way." I ask her what she means, worried she'll be late for her next class, but also wanting to be present with her in what feels like an important moment. "I know that babies grow in women's uterus," she declares. "But yesterday, I told my whole class that I grew in my mom's heart. And I meant it, even though I knew it couldn't be true. She said the whole class laughed at her. For years, Lydia's mom used the "you grew in my heart" metaphor to make clear that growing there is better than being born to someone who couldn't keep you. She surely meant no harm by this, but metaphors are powerful. They offer concrete visual images of hard-to-understand ideas. Metaphors can go beyond just helping us comprehend ideas. They can change the way we unconsciously think of a concept. For example, in 2011, sociologists Paul Thibodeau and Lera Boroditsky conducted a study about citizen response to a crime wave. Half of the participants read about the uptick in crime as an animal metaphor. A beast preyed upon innocent citizens. The other group read essentially the same description of the city, but were given a medical metaphor. A disease plagued the town. When the subjects were asked how to solve this crime issue, those who read the animal metaphor suggested control strategies, like increasing police presence and imposing stricter penalties. Those who read the medical metaphor suggested diagnostic or treatment strategies, such as seeking out the primary cause of the crime wave or bolstering the economy. The study showed that the wording of the metaphor changed the way the readers thought about the crime issue. If it was a beast, it needed to be controlled. If it was a disease, it needed to be treated. Metaphors subconsciously control our perceptions. I feel incomplete, Lydia says, twirling one of her braids around an index finger. When my mom says that I grew in her heart, it makes me feel like an alien. I know she loves me, but someone else gave birth to me, and I wish she'd admit that and let me know who that person is. Lydia reminded me of Ashton and the framed quote that her parents hung on her wall. Both girls were experiencing a clash between cultural narratives and personal truths. It was bound to happen, as cultural narratives aren't often about the truth. For Lydia, it was becoming difficult to assimilate into their adoptive families without understanding the full, unvarnished details. Many adoptees are told that their lives are better because of adoption. Appreciating the love, security, and stability our adoptive parents provide could all be undone by our striving to know the story behind the adoption. The tensions in the adoptee lounges are due to the feeling that yearning for answers about our birth family or adoption makes us seem ungrateful. For Lydia, the heart-growing metaphor confused and stifled her. It turned her quest to find language for what she'd experienced into a tightrope walk that she only felt comfortable exploring in the adoptee lounge. The way her adoptive mother's emotions are wrapped up in the metaphor made it exceedingly difficult for Lydia to label her adoption as the trauma that it is. The risk of undermining her parents' emotions was simply too great. So great that it led her to forego what she knew about anatomy to fit the emotional desire, the desire to believe her mom's words, that desire to be claimed. You grew in my heart. For Lydia, there was only room for one set of real parents. I'm grateful that for as long as I can remember, both of my parents demonstrated that they were able to hold two conflicting emotions at the same time. They fearlessly understood and named the paradox that they were so happy that I'd joined their family, and also longed for a world in which Deborah, my birth mother, could have kept me. They never balked or seemed scared when I asked questions about my birth family or why I was adopted. Perhaps they felt more than they showed, but to me, it seemed that they understood my ability to hold multiple truths at once would be bolstered by their modeling of this. Because of this, I was allowed to claim my adoptive parents, my foster parents, and my birth parents.
Thank you. That in my edition, the desire to be claimed, I underlined a bunch just thinking about that primal need. And I think in just listening to you read, I'm thinking actually a lot about our own personal journey, which is only ours, but that actually has been important both for our son and for his birth mom. Somewhere along the way, someone was wise enough to offer a line, which sometimes in my most scared moments, someone's offered some honesty of like, try this. And so I just have a moment of saying, okay, I trust the person that taught me this, and started to use it, saying to him, you don't ever have to choose, meaning you don't have to choose between your birth family and us, your adoptive family. Which I couldn't imagine that I would say that, or what would this impact be, but it was exactly this. It's like the steam getting out of the kettle, right? This opportunity to say, you don't have to carry that burden. It's not going to be an issue. And the doors that opens can be really powerful.
It seems like that would be really hard. It appears that that's very, 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 very hard for adoptive parents to say that sentence.
But well, adoptive parents, we don't live in a culture where it's set up in that way. You don't, as you're learning to be an adoptive parent, or at least in the time when we were coming into it, it was about being able to go help this kid, right? And it wasn't connected to the importance of holding the whole experience of the triad at the table, of recognizing that value and increasingly coming to understand what is the burden that the young person
Yeah, it's so
might
tricky.
carry.
Adoption is centered on this idea that helping us is, 3 meals a day, a home, all this love through material, but also emotional, but that it doesn't include, like we talked about, birth parents, that it doesn't include the full truth, as though we can't handle it, even though I experienced being ripped away from my birth mother when I was 2 seconds old, and to say, I did that. Like, how about we celebrate that you got through that, as a huge feat. That being able to say that out loud to our children is helping, as adoptive agencies might say, as much as 3 meals a day and a roof. It's a similar concept that I'm having around race, too, where people are, because of the Multi-Ethnic Placement Act, which is a law that prohibits any agency that receives federal funding cannot mandate prospective adoptive parents learn about race before adopting a child of color. It can be an extra thing.
As we're coming toward the end, it's hard because where could we stop? You and I could do this all day, really. One of the things I loved about this book is, in addition to you bringing in some of the most wonderful anecdotes that you've shared in your time as an educator, but you also talk a little bit about some of the industry. You talk about some of the structural stuff, and you bring a lot of perspective that we've just sort of wandered into. So I would encourage you all to dig in. That's one of the things that's different about this book. It's not just a memoir. I want to ask you a couple quick questions before we actually turn it over and get some questions from the audience. So you guys can begin thinking about what you might ask Angela. Can you just offer us some perspective on what would you recommend as signifiers or practices in a healthy home environment? And what about in a school environment? So thinking about the adolescent time of life, let's think about sort of moving into middle school and high school years. I'm sure we can also, I guess we could go younger as well. Lab starts in first grade. But what advice would you have for thinking about if folks are leaving here tonight or they're listening to this conversation, what can they think about in terms of, oh, let me keep doing more of that maybe, or wow, here's something I hadn't thought of that I might consider?
At school environments, one of the most kind of obvious things is around some assignments, and it's hard work because we've been conditioned away from this, but to look and see, do they privilege nuclear biological families, in the sense a real common one is asking students to do a family tree. This one actually has been talked about since the 90s, but maybe there are teachers who are assigning that, and if so, that needs to stop. Even for children who are not adopted, they have roots that are far and wide. I talk in the book about fictive kin. in the book, I'm really promoting a made-up word. I made up a word called the Sondersphere, and essentially it's trying to help us all go beyond what we're currently defining as family. So expanding our definition of family. This is true for assignments where we're asked to bring in photos of ourselves as babies. Not even for children who may truly not have any pictures of themselves. So if you're a school teacher and you know that a child is adopted internationally, like maybe that's a signifier, but also if they weren't, perhaps those early years really trigger some hard feelings, hard emotions that they haven't yet processed. This can be, it's not just if a child is adopted in foster care. I think there are some assignments like that we could start by thinking, having our children who are adopted in mind, but I think when you do that and expand assignments, we can see how it benefits so many other folks as well, including adults. There are a lot of aspects around race that we can be aware of. I hate to frame this just around transracial adoption. I remember working with a family who I had asked if the child has any professional care by someone who is the same race as them. And the parents were like, oh my gosh, no, like their doctor, their dentist, all their teachers, everyone's white around this kid. Oh no. So then they contacted me 2 weeks later. We're so excited, we found a black dentist. We're gonna have, they said, their adopted kid go to the black dentist, but the rest of the kids would go to the white dentist. And it's like funny, but not really, because I totally understand where that came from. And so just the simple question of what harm is it for all of the kids to go to the black doctor, black dentist? Your laughter is a little bit hard to hear because I do want to say that there's a lot of things in transracial adoption that once brought up seem so obvious, but before that we're all operating and we don't recognize it. So, and I include myself in this. I include myself in the title, You Should Be Grateful. It's not like a knock against everyone else who's said it. I think when I say the title of my book or people see the title, they're like, oh my gosh, I get it. I hate it when people say that. And everybody is saying that as though everyone else is saying it. And if that's the case, then all of us have said it, have implied it, or thought it too, myself included. So sometimes I'm like, let's just be graceful and understanding that we are all committing some of these infractions, and the duty is to name it, to say it, and then to move forward. The other aspect you talked about was the home environment, safety, and kind of some of the pillars that are helpful. And we touched on some of those, but having the courage to not assume that you know what your child is thinking, the adopted child. The common refrain I hear is just that when they're old enough, they will ask XYZ, or when they're old enough, we will visit. And adoptees may not tell you that. Hey mom, let's move to a neighborhood where it's 15% black instead of 2% black. We're not gonna say that to you. We wouldn't even say it in lesser terms. I know some parents were like, are you happy here in this neighborhood? You're our parents. We're not going to we're not going to say anything that might risk us losing you, which means saying something that might upset you. That's a humongous risk that, my goodness, it's scary to take.
Yes.
Which is why I think so many adoptees, again, feel most comfortable speaking with other adoptees, even when parents are right there saying, you can talk to me, I'm here for this. It's at that point really not about you. It's about the fear of abandonment.
Yes. Angela, we're going to switch to the Q&A portion. I just want to take a moment to say, how much I appreciate you, your integrity, your honesty, your willingness to just really bring it. It's something I've valued in you since I first met you, and so thank you for being here and sharing some truth that I hope we can all make a little actionable in wherever we go from here. So let's do this, friends. What I'd like to do, because we have some limited time, maybe about 10 minutes since we started 10 minutes late. We have microphones, and a couple members of the lab community will bring a microphone over. If you'd like to ask Angela a question, please ask a question in like one sentence. If you need to elaborate, please do it quickly. And I would just ask you to as well be mindful of, we've each shared some personal stories, but if you were an adoptive parent, for example, and your kid isn't here, they may not be thrilled to have you sharing some of that story. So just be mindful as you ask your question. There's a question. Oh, we got a couple questions already. Thank you. Morgan, will you just, head this way? Could you wait for just a moment for the microphone if you don't mind?
Hi, thank you so much for this conversation. Just thinking about making space for questions and discussing, I think probably a lot of us would say we've tried to kind of make space and make it feel open for our adopted kids to ask questions and give them the language to ask them. But like I don't want to just share information necessarily because it can be re-traumatizing, or maybe they're not ready for that, or maybe they don't. So I guess the question is about how much we lead the conversation as parents versus waiting for the kids to lead it, because of course, like you said, sometimes they won't.
In reframing it, I think a common experience many adoptive parents have, but simply, how do we share information in open and honest ways and understand how to do that and to be calm and strong to support our kids in that conversation? Is that a...
Yeah, but also like when do they ask the questions and when do you offer the information that they might be afraid to ask, I guess?
Something that I loved in my family was it didn't feel so tennis match-ish. It felt like I'm hanging out in the corner, reading a book, minding my own business. My parents are chatting with each other while they're cooking about saying things about adoption. I'm in earshot, but I don't like to be, I know many adoptees don't like to be made to feel like I'm only talking about this because you're here. Like, I only care about Black Lives Matter because I have a black son, so sit down, let's talk about Jordan Neely. It's like, I'm overhearing my parents say, wow, did you hear about Jordan Neely in the subway? This happened and that happened. That is giving me permission to have that conversation. I'm getting a demonstration that they're able to handle it, that they know these terms. So I think I spoke about this earlier, but this desire to wait until they're ready, AKA let them ask me the question, just isn't gonna happen. It is so scary. And the way that I think it's mitigated is if you demonstrate that you are already talking about it. So I'm not, I can't answer specifics because I don't know what information you're talking about, but I would say that there shouldn't be any information that's off limits that is not being talked about in the home. If the information is that birth dad stabbed somebody and is in prison, we're not going to say he stabbed, and the kid is like 5 years old, you could say, wow, like the consequences for people's actions. You could be talking to someone else, your friend who knows the adoption story. You're in a safe place, they're there. Gosh, consequences for actions are so important to understand that if you do X, then Y is going to happen, and giving an example of someone else. That is, you're indirectly telling your child, like, I'm ready to talk about this. I hope that makes a little bit of sense. There's age-appropriate ways to communicate everything.
Can I add an adoptive parent perspective
Please.
on that, if that's okay? Find other adoptive parents who may be a little farther down the road and work on that with them. That they, it is about, my experience is understanding what my fear is about and what am I worried about, and then doing some of that work. I have had a lot of complicated conversations with my kiddo. There hasn't been a single one that he hasn't handled with all sorts of brilliance. Not to mean it was it can be uncomfortable, it's hard, there's a lot going on, but kids are brilliant. And even when it's hard and stressful, they can bring amazing things, and we're making the problem harder sometimes.
It is surprising the things that I hear adoptive parents fear sharing, and then the things that adoptees are like, you know.
Yeah.
like,
We're so
whatever.
worried about messing up, right?
Absolutely, I understand where that fear, and we want to protect our child at all costs. Protecting an adoptee does not mean keeping them from the truth. We already know something happened. Tell us what happened. You know, I think another example is, thank you for those snaps. Another example, I knew that my birth mother experienced homelessness when she was pregnant with me. That was one of the only details we really knew. And instead of, Angela, your birth mom was homeless, just telling me that, and then going about our day, which if left to our own devices currently, when we see homeless people, we look away, we don't look at them, right? Don't make eye contact. Instead of that, and not tying it to my adoption, our whole family went to soup kitchens a lot when I was younger. And what that taught me was that people who are houseless are human. I think I talk about this in the book, but it was a really big moment for me when I was dishing somebody up and they said, I don't like peas. And I was like, oh, my little brain, you're homeless and you can be picky, you know? And as I got older, I was like, and then it led to, maybe my birth mom has favorite foods and foods she doesn't like. That's all great, right? Just humanizing individuals.
Thank you. Let's do another, pause just a quick second. Here comes Anthony. Bring in the mic. Thank you.
I just wanted to express the fact that I think that if
Can you
people
hold the
just
mic
learn,
a little bit closer to your mouth? So
yeah, if people just learn how to love one another, regardless of what color your skin is, if you're green from Mars, if they just learn how to love each other, I think the entire adoption process would. The courses should not be on whether you know how to feed them 3 meals or give them clothes and their clothes are folded in their drawer. It should be really, truly, honestly, if you love other people. And that doesn't seem to be part of the crash course. So that upsets me, but it also upsets me that kids can come into other families and come into these cultures of civilization whereby even the races have intra-racial discrimination. Here in the United States, if you're a pale-skinned African American versus whether you go over into Europe or Africa, the darker you are, the better it is. And you saw that in the biography for Kobe Bryant when he spent 6 years in Italy, and he was like, even though he wasn't adopted, and so the kids have to grow up not only with hormonal adolescent changes and cultural changes, but then there is this racial discrimination even between.
Is your question about colorism?
Yeah, absolutely. As part of now the adoptive parent has to somehow kind of mend those fences, but they're not trained in any kind of adoption courses as to, okay.
There are
So
trainings.
part of the question, tying it together, is thinking about what are the things, the priorities, and the things that adoptive parents might need to understand to navigate the journey of being an adoptive parent. Thank you.
Yes.
I think we talked about a lot of that tonight. I also think, I'm not sure if you meant it this way, but you started by saying love is all we should be talking about, and that you said it's frustrating that that's not part of the crash course. I feel like tonight everything we've talked about is about how to demonstrate love. The things that you talked about in the latter half of your question around colorism, if a white parent doesn't understand what that means, what it is, how they are participating in that, then I would agree that you're not showing the child love. One example is, you've got to understand the brown paper bag test. So any white parent of a black or brown kid who doesn't know what that is is likely not able to fully love their child, because they're going to see their beautiful dark-skinned child and say, you should be anything you want to be, I support you, I'll do everything for you, and they won't understand that our society says no. Because in 1950, if you were darker than a brown paper bag, you couldn't go in here and there, and that still actually plays itself out today. And unfortunately, I still partake. I'm totally aware of this, but on Instagram, if I'm posting a story, I often choose a filter that lightens my skin. Very frustrated about that for myself, frustrated that that's an option. What am I doing? Oh, I'm buying into that belief that if you're lighter skinned, you're prettier, you're smarter, you're all of these things that were said in the past and are still said today through things like that. So kind of a part of your question around, just love the kid, it is in understanding the history.
Thank you. Can we do one more in the back?
Okay, hello, my name's Elena, good evening. Great conversation. Thoughts and advice for adoptive parents. I'm a Colombian adoptee, and as you mentioned before, many different generations, we have different experience with our adoptive parents. Many of my friends and adoptees, adult adoptees, are changing their names back. Thoughts on why, I don't even know if it's still happening, if adoptive parents are changing names, because it's a very big thing for our identity and growth. And coupled with that, kind of picking off the last comment, resources or things adoptive parents can do to recognize implicit bias. A lot of my friends, our families are racist. Mine is. I just realized this last year because I didn't want to realize it, but it took 42 years. So thoughts on having those conversations, even if there are trainings, but what you can do for yourself as an individual person, because for me, that is showing love. So thank you.
That was a two-parter.
It was. Will you tackle the part that you'd like, and let me say what we'll be doing is wrapping, and we'll give you some appreciation, and then Angela is going to be exiting the side, and then I would just invite everyone, let's move the conversations into what we call Main Street here, so that the folks that are going to be striking the theater can do so, and we can continue these conversations. So,
yeah,
Angela.
I can answer part one. Yes, a lot of adoptive parents are still renaming their child. I think that has a lot to do with ownership. I talk about this in the book, but the sense of ownership over a child is what many adoptive parents subconsciously perhaps want, and as well as assimilation, thinking it'll be easier if they change the kid's name into something that is, I can't say easier to pronounce because I think that's a choice, but it's something they're familiar with. And I do see a lot of adult adoptees then choosing to reclaim their culture, reclaim themselves. And this is beautifully explained and is a resource, as you requested, through Jaron Kim, Susan Bronco Alvarado, two incredible adoptees who are also professors, created this adoptee consciousness model. And essentially, many of you are probably familiar with the stages of grief, for example. That's gotten very and kind of doctrinated in our community. Well, this new model is a little bit like that, but for adoptees and the phases that many adoptees go through towards reclaiming themselves. And one of the latter phases has to do with that. For some, it's names. For others, it's visiting their home country, their home continent. I recommend that, hands down. You may hear adoptees use a phrase, out of the fog. They'll say, I came out of the fog when I was giving birth to my first child, which means in this adoptee consciousness model, they started to have understandings that perhaps their parents were racist, as you speak of, or think about what my birth mother must have gone through when she was pregnant, or all of these things start to become more integrated with their sense of who they are. But yeah, I see that a lot. I think there's a dearth of professionals who are capable of having a conversation with prospective adopters about what part of this process is theirs and what part is this new child, and which parts need to remain that way. And instead, we get a little bit of enmeshment, and then we have to, that's the part I think that I'm spending all my days working on right now.
Thank you, Angela. Will you guys please give Angela a thank you. So beyond this incredible book, we've talked about the Adoptee Mentoring Society, which may be of interest to some of you. We've talked about the Adopted Life episodes, which are still online.
Yes, AngelaTucker.com, as well as 2 other great short films about adoption that you can look at just to share my own work.
So
I'm not just trying to share my own work. It's all, another piece of this was that Catherine helped with the Adopted Life episodes, making sure that they would be open source and free so that they can be used for these conversation starters. It's a resource.
I believe even Beth Wheeler, is she still in here?
Yes.
Did you help to write the discussion
Discussion
script? Yeah, so there are even like discussion notes. So for those of you that are educators or you know educators, this is a pretty simple resource that's approachable and they can use in classrooms or wherever. So Angela, again, thank you for being here, Lab School. Thank you for having her. We really appreciate it.